So, controversial take here, but The Legend of Korra is worse than Avatar The Last Airbender. Hold your applause. Yes, I am indeed a very brave soul for saying such a thing publicly. Avatar is one of the best shows ever made. It has like 4 different characters who are in the running for best character arc of all time. Its soundtrack is one of the best ever composed. Its fight scenes hold up 20 years later. And most importantly perhaps, its heart is in the right place with its themes and characters. It's hard making a sequel to such a show, and Korra, well, it didn't succeed fully. And a lot of that could and should be blamed on studio interference and budget cuts, whether it's the bad animation, or rushed storytelling, or bad dialogue.
That tram goes to the training camp.
Everything was delivered to the prison, sir.
Some might even say that it's unfair to compare these two shows, that they each should be discussed on their own terms. Nothing could have surpassed Avatar anyway. I don't agree with this argument for a few reasons. Firstly, because Korra begs to be compared to and seen as a successor of Avatar. From bringing back old characters, even doing somersaults to bring back dead ones, to retconning lore from the original show, to returning to iconic locations. And look at this scene from episode 8 of season 1 of Korra.
The arena might be shut down, but we're still a team! The new Team Avatar! Get ready, Republic City. You are about to be patrolled by Team Avatar. I like the new Team Avatar style.
Any analysis of the show is incomplete without first considering Avatar. Secondly, and more importantly for what this video is about, I believe one of the main reasons Avatar has, and will continue to have, stood the test of time is exactly the reason Korra has not, and will continue to not. And it's interesting to see how one show succeeded so well, while the other, while made by the same people, failed so miserably. That shared reason is, Avatar is incredibly politically radical and nuanced, while Korra is one of the most lukewarm, status quo glazing conservative propaganda pieces I've ever seen. Like, I'm gonna get into this, obviously, but just so you understand the incredible gap between these two shows, Avatar literally has an episode where the main characters commit eco-terrorism and fucking blow up a factory that is polluting the water of a nearby village, and that action is not questioned morally once, which to this day I cannot believe was allowed on the Nickelodeon cartoon. While in Korra, the character who kills the corrupt monarch we have seen oppress our own people for a full season is supposed to be the villain, and the kingdom is plunged into complete chaos the second the queen is gone, because I guess monarchs are the only thing stopping people from robbing and killing each other. It's literally real-life medieval propaganda. Like, can you even imagine a more ill-advised moral judgment in your American cartoon? This is literally driving me crazy. How did they not know that people don't like monarchies? Were they momentarily mind-controlled by British boomers? Anyway, we will get into that and way more, because both of these shows are very rich with political ideology. So without further ado, let's start with season 1 of The Legend of Korra. The Legend of Korra brings us back to the world of Avatar 70 years after the original show's finale, with more advanced technology and political systems and climates more resembling our current reality. That's not inherently a bad choice, as the world has aged up, so has the show and its main characters, from young teens in Avatar to young adults in Korra. The creators said they wanted the show to age up with its audience, become more mature. That might also not seem like an inherently bad choice. That is, unless you've watched Avatar The Last Airbender. Telling mature stories in the world of Avatar is a wonderful idea. So wonderful, in fact, that Avatar The Last Airbender already did that. Avatar is a show about war, genocide, colonialism, spirituality, extremely mature themes. Of course it's a show that is still accessible to kids, but it has those themes unquestionably. How do you age up a story like that? Well, you insert not one, but 2 boring love triangles, of course. Exactly what was stopping Avatar from being regarded as one of the best shows of all time. Oh wait. This is not what maturity is. Korra does actually get into some mature themes Avatar did not later in the show, especially at the end of season 3 and beginning of season 4, but not in this season. This is all the aesthetics of maturity, like a bad live-action Netflix remake. I'm not here to talk about the atrocious love triangles, or the way the 2 men in them are watered-down versions of fan-favorite characters from the original show. Many videos have been made about all of that. Most of the ones not made by Lily Orchard are even pretty good. I'm here to talk about the politics of the season. Since the 100-Year War is over at this point, there is relative peace in the world. People from different nations are coexisting, the greatest example of which is Republic City, a land of opportunity. And a very clear parallel to America, or at least the creator's idea of what America is, with Aang being the literal Statue of Liberty. This show is not subtle. Not all is well though. There's gangs fighting in the city, there's homelessness, though the show treats the latter more as a joke and not as a horrific consequence of industrialized society. But we will get into that soon. There is also an uprising of non-benders who call themselves the Equalists. They claim to be oppressed by benders. Are they really? The show is certainly reluctant to show us that happening. Not enough time, I guess, with all the necessary screen time for the very important love triangles. This is one of the reasons why we are, as an audience, not predisposed to sympathize with the Equalists. The show inherently presents them as whiny babies. After all, the people who created this supposedly coexisting city are our heroes from The Last Airbender, and since we love them and trust them, it's hard for us to believe their mission failed and Republic City is a place of inequality without a lot of evidence. And we never get that evidence, we actually get evidence to the contrary. Aang's son is a bender, and his wife is a non-bender, and they seem to be doing fine. She doesn't even support the Equalists in the slightest. The non-benders of the city only get harassed by the bending powers that be as a reaction to the Equalist threat, so really the Equalists are creating their own problems. When their charismatic leader is bested by Korra, shown to be a fraud and a bender, the movement fully breaks apart, which obviously wouldn't be the case if the Equalist ranks and supporters had any gripes of their own with the status quo. So the show is telling us again and again and again through all these ways that the Equalists are overreacting and should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and accept the systems of power they live under. That's odd if you know anything about the history of any civil rights movements or working class power movements, especially since there is an incredibly convincing argument to be made that being a bender is a legit privilege in this world. You can't be a pro-bender, obviously. You can't serve in some roles in the police that require bending. You can't defend yourself against attacks or harassment from benders if you're a non-bender, etc, etc. The show waddles back and forth between presenting the Equalists as a civil rights movement and a class movement. The aesthetics are clearly borrowed from scary communist posters, another way to make us start off as unsympathetic towards them. But perhaps the most major way the show makes it extremely hard to side with the Equalists is exceedingly simple. Their goal is to make the show less interesting. If you ask me in the real world whether I think the existence of guns make the world a worse or better place, it wouldn't require much thought to say guns are a net negative. Therefore, if there was someone trying to remove guns from the world, as long as they took them away from everyone equally and not just gave the police and army a greater monopoly on violence, I'd support that person or movement. If I'm watching a John Wick movie though, and someone told me John Wick movies should stop having guns in them, I'd laugh in their face. Guns are the basic building block of John Wick. They are the main language of the films, how they communicate and resolve their conflicts and plots. Are there cool action movies out there devoid of guns? Of course. But not the John Wick franchise. Do you get my point? Bending is so core to the world of Avatar and Korra. Without it, it's just an extremely basic and uninteresting fantasy world. The lore is built around bending, the cultures are, the spiritualities, the language of conflict and resolution. Nobody who has watched The Last Agni Kai would ever side with the people who want to remove bending from this world. So Korra makes you take a conservative position by weaponizing your love for Avatar against you. Not intentionally, probably, but it does that nonetheless. For a season whose main plot is entirely based around the concept of equality, it's sure odd how season 1 of Korra is so deeply uninterested in inequality. In the penultimate episode of the season, our heroes are hiding in the underground sewers, alongside a community of homeless people. Watching their interactions, it's impossible to not think about what Aang and his friends would do, how they would react to seeing people in such deep suffering. Katara would be furious, Sokka would try to find a creative way to help, Toph would learn a lesson about freedom, stability, and privilege. Zuko would be pessimistic about anything being able to change, but finally convinced by Aang that it's possible, just like how he changed. Or maybe they'll react in completely different ways, depending on the place they are in their respective arcs. But they would undoubtedly react somehow, feel something, make us feel something. By the end of the episode, these people would be doing better thanks to our heroes, even if just in a small way. In Korra, nobody gives a single shit. The fact they eat slop salvaged from dumpsters is played as a fucking joke.
I culled it from the finest dumpsters the city has to offer.
Asami, who grew up in such unbelievable luxury reserved only for monarchs in the times of Avatar, does not question anything about her place in the world. Mako and Bolin, who grew up on the streets, pay no mind to how easily they could have been living in these conditions right now if they didn't have their natural and arbitrary bending skills, which would make so much fucking sense because it would add some nuance to the question of the equalists. I'm sorry for getting angry, but this might be my most hated scene in the entirety of Korra. It's rotten to its core. In a normal show, saying this inequality would not only impact our characters, which again, it doesn't, but also make us as an audience sympathize, at least to a degree, with the revolutionary villains. If this is what the status quo is like for so many, is it really worth defending? But the opposite happens here. The most victimized in society hold no hope for the revolution. They are paradoxically put up as an example of its foolishness.
We got benders and non-benders living together down here. Do you see us fighting? No, siree. We figured out how to harmoniously coexist.
Clearly, everything is fine. And these so-called equalists are just violent babies with too much time on their hands. Which leads us to the question of, who are the equalists? Who comprises their ranks and popular support? Because they clearly have popular support amongst non-benders. Their rallies are huge, and their perceived threat is enough to turn the city on its head. In a more thoughtful show, this fact would be used as a tool to add some nuance and make us and our protagonist question the validity of their struggle. At least try to understand why so many people are willing to put their lives in danger for this cause. Now, the fact there is popular support for an idea or movement obviously doesn't always mean it's the correct one. There are too many historical examples of that to name, but it does mean something is wrong. Not necessarily what people think is wrong, not necessarily something fixable by their movement, but something. Happy, content people don't usually put their lives on the line to try and radically change the world. Some do, but they are not the majority. The more apparent the problems of a society are, the more people are willing to give up on the status quo and get radicalized, either to the bad direction, the right, or the good direction, the left. Radical, dangerous solutions seem much more appealing when the status quo is unbearable and slow reformism seems too slow, which it is, to be clear, at least in our world. So what is the problem or problems at the core of Republic City? Non-bender oppression? Well, the show doesn't really seem to think it exists.
I'm not oppressing anyone! You're oppressing yourself!
Income inequality? Sure exists, but the show never frames it as an issue. The gangs wreaking havoc in the city? Well, when Amon takes the gang leaders and members bending away, that is framed as a bad thing, and the movement doesn't stop there, so that's clearly not what's motivating it. Also, why is Amon taking their bending away a bad thing? Aang took away the Fire Lord's bending, and we even see him take away a mob boss's bending in the flashback this season, so clearly, the show thinks it's a valid method to reduce the harm done by dangerous benders. Whatever, I should not expect this show to have a consistent ideology. If it's not any of these apparent problems, what is it that's driving all the equalists and their allies into action? Trick question? It's nothing really, or at least nothing that deep. How do I know that? Well, when their leader is revealed to be a fraud, you see, he's a waterbender and was using blood bending to take away people's bending, say that 3 times fast, the movement just completely disappears. Cutting off the head just completely dissolves any will for fighting from anyone else. This is unbelievably stupid and legitimately disrespectful to the masses. They are just sheep, fooled by a charismatic leader, which would be fine if you wanted to tell a story about a cult maybe, but not about an ideology or a social movement. John Locke has been dead for well over 300 years, but liberalism is still going strong. Marx has been dead for 150, but Marxism still exists. Mussolini is not around anymore, but fascists and their little punchable faces still make the world a worse place every fucking day. That's because history is not created by important, in good or bad ways, people. It's the other way around. History creates important people. The conditions that create movements would exist even without the specific people who headed them being born. Maybe they would gain popularity later, or take a different form, but if the conditions are there, it's not about anyone individually. We will come back to this great man of history ideology of Korra later. It's a big change from the much less hierarchical story of Avatar, one in which every character matters and all their battles are equally important. There's a reason why Aang defeating Ozai, Zuko and Katara defeating Azula, Iroh and the White Lotus decolonizing Ba Sing Se, and Toph, Suki and Sokka destroying the airships are all seen as necessary components of victory. Anyway, this choice to make the Equalists' only thinking member Amon is cowardly, and perhaps worse, boring. It makes it so we never have to question our own moral standing. It makes the Equalists an easy problem to solve, and then everything can return to the status quo. The only other member of the Equalists with any shown reason to be one is Sato, Asami's dad, who is doing it for purely personal and vengeance-filled reasons.
These people, these benders, they took away your mother, the love of my life.
Nothing systemic or sensical. The fact the show thinks one needs a personal reason to support anything but the status quo is quite telling, I think, and is the first example of Korra being a show so unwilling to side with anyone but the powers that be, as opposed to another show, one all about fighting oppression and changing the world into a different, better one. We underrate the first two episodes of Avatar. When people talk about their favorite episodes of Season 1, it's always The Storm, the episode that finally shares Zuko's backstory and lays the seeds for his eventual redemption, The Sovereign Air Temple, the episode that shows us in no uncertain terms the results of the genocide the Air Nomads suffered, or The Siege of the North Part 1 and 2, the epic conclusion to the first book of the series. The Boy in the Iceberg and The Avatar Returns, the first two episodes of the series, might not be as flashy as those episodes, but they are just as, if not more, important. Not only because they introduce us to the world and characters, but more importantly for this video, they introduce us to the dual themes of this season, and arguably of the entire show. Those themes being, war steals away the humanity, the childhood, the joy of everyone involved. Violence kills the soul of the victims and rots the soul of those who enact it. And at the same time, like a resilient weed growing from a crack in concrete, life finds a way. People make connections and find moments of living. They have to. I use the word war here because I think it applies, and also because that is the word used in the show, but don't take me wrong. The Fire Nation has committed a genocide not just against the Air Nomads, but also against the Water Tribes. It is all but confirmed in no uncertain terms in Book 3's The Southern Raiders, which we will get to when we get there, but for now, consider the Fire Navy ship, entrapped by unnatural ice at the outskirts of the little village. Clearly Katara is not able to do such a thing, so there used to be more benders, trained and powerful ones. The question of what happened to them is planted in our minds, and then we get to see, in the Siege of the North, a Fire Nation ship suffer the same fate by the hands of waterbenders. It takes dozens of them. The idea of a dozen, not to mention dozens, more adults living in this tiny village is hard to even visualize. And since not everyone is born a bender, it's actually much more than that. With no words said, the unimaginable collective trauma the Southern Water Tribe went through is shown to us through a couple of moments of environmental storytelling. The void created by the gone weighs on the remaining people, and the clearest way we see that is with their inability to be children. Sokka is the clearest example of that. He was entrusted with being the man of the village when the actual men left to fight the Fire Nation in the only frontier not yet won by them, the Earth Kingdom. And to him, that means growing up and being a fighter. He constantly gets into arguments with Aang, who is trying to have fun and play with the kids of the village. The kids that Sokka entrusted with the title of warriors.
This lesson is for warriors only.
Whee!
Stop it right now! What's wrong with you? We don't have time for fun and games with a war going on.
Sokka can't allow himself to be a child, and the series shows us the complexity of that. We get to see Sokka's incredible bravery when he stands alone against the Fire Navy ship. It's one of my favorite shots ever. But we also get to see how absurd he's being, refusing 8-year-olds their bathroom breaks because of so-called warrior training.
I gotta pee.
Listen, until your fathers return from the war, they're counting on you to be the men of this tribe. That means no potty breaks.
Constantly being on guard and suspecting even Aang as a Fire Nation spy, building easily collapsible guard towers from snow.
Oh, man!
It's heartening and beautiful that Sokka is willing to fight for the people he cares about, but he shouldn't have to. And he can't. Not alone. He's beaten by Zuko, who at that point is not even the most skilled fighter in the world, instantly. When Aang returns to save Sokka and the village, Zuko is surprised by the fact he's just a kid.
You're the Avatar? You're just a child.
And then Aang answers,
Well, you're just a teenager.
when I watched Avatar for the first time, these characters were so much older than me, but now, watching it as an adult, the power of that statement hit me like a truck. Zuko is just a teenager. Just like Aang, he's also basically just a kid. He was also forced to grow up too fast, made to see violence as the only way to be what he thinks he needs to be. War does not allow kids to be kids, and yet kids are kids. Always have been, and always will be. Aang is an obvious manifestation of that, bringing joy and laughter into the Water Tribe again. When he goes penguin sledding with Katara, and she says,
I haven't done this since I was a kid.
he says in his own plain yet profound way,
You still are a kid.
it would be easy to make Aang just an uncomplicated example of childlike wonder, joy, and game. But he's more complicated than that. Aang is not joy and happiness for lack of experience of violence, but despite it. He got the call to grow up, to be what the world thought it needed, and by that to lose his childhood, become a vessel for something greater. But he refused it. He did the childish thing of running away from his problems. And it saved his life. In a way, it saved the air nomads, allowing one of them to survive. It also ruined him though. How could it not? So in a way, Aang wasn't able to escape the toll of war. The monks tried to take his childhood for a greater good, and by fleeing, an even greater weight was put on his shoulders. Not just protecting his culture among many fighters, but as the sole carrier of its memory. Not just as an important piece in some war coming up on the horizon, but as the deciding factor in one that must end in a few months. These extra weights he accumulates, first in the Southern Air Temple, when he learns of the fate of his people, and then in the Fire Nation Temple, when he learns he must end the genocidal campaign of the Fire Lord by the end of the summer, change Aang. But they don't make him a different character. There is an extra depth behind his attitude now.
You, me, and Appa, we're all that's left of this place. We have to stick together.
But he doesn't stop being a fun-loving rascal. This would be a fascinating dialectic to put into your protagonist already, but Avatar doesn't stop there. Even Sokka and Katara, the two people Aang saves most clearly with the fun he brings, are not a one-dimensional foil to him. In the only scene in the show preceding Aang's introduction into the story, where the future seemed even more unbelievably bleak, when the war had even less of an end in sight, what were Sokka and Katara doing? Bickering, like the teenage siblings they are, annoying each other and roasting each other and being kids.
An ancient art unique to our culture, blah, blah, blah.
You're calling me weird? I'm not the one who makes muscles at myself every time I see my reflection in the water.
This is the inciting incident for the entire story. It's what gets the infamous boy out of the infamous iceberg.
You don't like my steering? Well, maybe you should have waterbended us out of the ice.
So it's my fault.
I knew I should have left you home. Leave it to a girl to screw things up.
You are the most sexist, immature, nut-brained... I'm embarrassed to be related to you! That's it, I'm done helping you. From now on your own!
It's what saves the world. Now let's talk about the people the world needs saving from, the Fire Nation. How did they get to this point? The point where they genocided 2 out of the 4 major players of the world and colonized the 3rd. The Fire Nation subscribes to a fascist, ethno-supremacist ideology, one based on a perceived cultural biological superiority. In episode 6, Imprisoned, we hear the warden of a prison camp set up for earthbenders voice this ideology aloud for the first time, when he refers to earthbending, the sacred art of Earth Kingdom culture, as
that brutish savagery that passes for bending among you people.
We see Zhao, the major villain of the season, use a similar rhetoric in episode 13, The Blue Spirit.
We are the sons and daughters of fire, the superior element.
And like, We don't really need to hear people say it out loud, right? You can't engage in the war crimes the Fire Nation is engaging in without some sort of supremacist justification, without some level of dehumanization. And the thing about dehumanization is that it's just like fire. It grows as it feeds, and jumps to the next source of fuel. The fascistic in-group is one that only grows smaller and smaller, until there's no one left. What better example of this is there than the war meeting that led to Zuko's banishment, that started his character arc? The Fire Nation are willing to murder for their conquest. That's not surprising, it's a prerequisite for waging war. The jump from that to sacrificing their own soldiers in the name of defeating the Earth Kingdom is not a big one. If you're willing to kill innocents for a goal, what does it matter if they're from your side or theirs? The General's plan of using a battalion of fresh recruits as bait against powerful earthbenders is not an outlandish one by Fire Nation standards, but it is to Zuko. Just like Aang, who despite all odds succeeds in keeping his spirit, Zuko succeeds in keeping his soul.
You can't sacrifice an entire division like that! Those soldiers love and defend our nation! How can you betray them?
And what I love so much about this moment is that I don't believe him. No, of course I believe he finds his plan unacceptable, I just don't believe his reasoning is honest. The fact they are patriotic and love the Fire Nation, that's not Zuko speaking, that's his upbringing. He has this spark inside him, telling him that life is worth something, deserves protecting, but he doesn't have the vocabulary to express that. The Fire Nation does not believe in the scarcity of life. It's a laughable idea to them.
Ba Sing Se must be something to behold. I hope you all may see it someday, if we don't burn it to the ground first.
He can't accept that it's not to him, so he comes up with a reason that fits into the ideology: patriotism. The issue is, he's not integrated enough, not old and worn enough to understand that nobody in power really believes that shit. They're not waging this genocide for their citizens, but for themselves. It's just a lie they tell those beneath them. And he bought it. And him buying it saves his soul. And later, the world. So these are the overarching themes that, in my mind, define this book of Avatar. But a big difference between Avatar and Korra is how much less linear and more episodic the former is. It's a rich tapestry of interlocking and sometimes contradicting pieces. While I stand by the fact that the twin themes I discussed are in a way this season's core statement, unlike Season 1 of Korra, Season 1 of Avatar is not content with saying just one thing. Let's look at two specific episodes then. The two that most deeply clash with the simplistic ideology of Korra. Starting with episode 6, Imprisoned. In a tiny village terrorized by a Fire Nation occupying force, earthbending is illegal. Katara convinces a young man named Haru to use his bending to save a man's life. But the man turns him in and he gets taken to an on-water open-air prison where the rest of the region's earthbenders are held. This would be a pretty normal setup for a Prison Break episode. Katara would get Haru and his dad out, and they would reunite with Haru's mom as one happy family. And that is the plan early on. But when Katara sees the conditions the prisoners are kept in, she refuses to stick to it.
I'm not leaving. I'm not giving up on these people.
This stops being a Prison Break episode, it becomes a prison takeover episode. How could it not be? After we see these horrible conditions, the lack of heating, the shortage of supplies...
The prisoners are complaining there aren't enough blankets to go around.
I'll talk to the guards. In the meantime, make sure the elderly are taken care of. The rest of us will simply have to hope for warmer weather.
The unappetizing and innutritious food, which, looky here, is not used as a fucking punchline. How fucking crazy. This episode has literally the exact same scene as in Korra, except done with a modicum of respect for human life and dignity.
It's not as bad as it looks.
I culled it from the finest dumpsters the city has to offer.
It's still pretty bad, though.
How could Katara save those she knows and leave those she doesn't? They all have families, they all deserve to live a dignified life. The most easily thought of defense of why nobody in Korra looks to help the unhoused people they meet is that they simply have bigger things to deal with, fighting the Equalists and all that. That's stupid as shit though. Firstly because, then why don't they help them later, when the Equalist threat is neutralized? Secondly, this episode of Avatar eviscerates that argument by telling us there is no bigger fight large enough to make you apathetic towards people in need. What happens if Korra and her team lose? One city becomes under the rule of one ruling class rather than another, and benders become non-benders. Boo-hoo. If non-benders are not worse off than benders, as the show claims, why should people even care? Now what happens if Katara and Sokka don't get Aang to the North Pole in time, and therefore he doesn't master waterbending in time, to then master the other forms of bending in time? A fascist ethnostates continue to colonize the world and kill everyone. The show isn't saying, oh, the Fire Nation is too big of a thing to fight, we should focus on smaller things now. It says we can do both. We have to do both. None of us are free till all of us are free. It's also important to note that the inmates play a major role in their own liberation. The episode easily could have been one in which Aang, Katara and Sokka fight the warden and guards by themselves to open the way for the detained to escape, but that's not what happens here. They walk alongside them and give them the tools they need to free themselves. When do the characters in season 1 of Korra ever care about the input or camaraderie of the people they are supposedly saving? Never. They are white knights saving the people from a revolution many of them themselves support. Who are their allies? The ruling class, the police, and the fucking army. Real progressive show you got there. The tools Team Avatar gives the imprisoned so that they are able to fight are hope, which is important, and weapons, which is also pretty important. The episode is showing us how both are necessary for liberation. Katara's first speech, the one before the call is brought into play, fails to spark the rebellion, but even her second speech, after she brought the ammunition, does not immediately lead to mass revolt. It leads to Haru throwing a rock at the warden, and then the warden attacks him, and his father defends him, which leads to an all-out battle in which the rest of the prisoners join. Weapons by themselves weren't motivation enough either. They needed to be reminded of what they are fighting for, protecting each other. If you cheer Haru on when he throws that rock at his wardens, when he takes his rightful first step towards liberation, but think real-life kids throwing rocks at the heavily armed wardens of their own open-air prison are somehow the villains of that interaction, you need to ask yourself why you are more angry at the oppression of fictional, animated characters than at the oppression of real, flesh and blood people. Now let's talk about my favorite episode of season 1 of Avatar, an unbelievably complex and nuanced look at dehumanization. The Deserter. The episode starts at the Fire Nation Festival, which is creatively named a fire festival. It's our first real interaction with Fire Nation civilians beside the old guy in jet. They're oddly normal. Eating snacks and watching a juggling show and wearing fun masks. We are shown they can be human, but importantly, we are also immediately shown how they are made not to be. The gang passes by a kid's puppet show, starring the Fire Lord. When an Earth Kingdom soldier sneaks up on him, the kids become worried, and then the tension is released when the Fire Lord discovers him and burns him alive. Kids are naturally empathetic, and their suspension of disbelief is not yet fully developed. These kids were worried for a puppet representing a man they've never even seen in person, nor will they ever. To see them celebrate someone going up in flames, it's disturbing, it's unnatural. Simultaneously a result of, and a building block of, the dehumanization they are taught. I like that we are given no reason to think that it's state-sponsored propaganda. I don't think the puppeteer is under any order to make this show in this way. They're most likely not thinking, today I'm gonna dehumanize the Earth Kingdom people for a bunch of kids. They're just regurgitating what they already know. I think we are intentionally taught a very limited definition of propaganda, one that makes us able to name propaganda straight from the state, but not propaganda that passes through a few layers first. Read Capitalist Realism or Post-Capitalist Desire by Mark Fisher if you want to hear more about this modern capitalist propaganda, but basically think about how even now that the MCU is not directly paid by the US military, yes, they used to be, they still make propaganda for them. It's important to show that the Fire Nation's ideology is exactly that, an ideology, learned and not innate. With understanding that, we can start talking about Zhong. The first thing we learn about Zhong is that he is a Fire Army deserter, the first to make it out alive.
A living legend, Zhong the Deserter. He was a Fire Nation general. but he couldn't take the madness anymore. He's the first person ever to leave the army and live.
The simple truth by omission tells us what kind of episode this is going to be. One that shakes our black and white, totalizing view of the Fire Nation and its people. People try to desert the army? Enough that the idea of someone doing it and surviving is enough to make him a living legend? The ruthless firebenders we fought throughout the season have an added question mark next to them now. How many of them don't leave for fear of their lives? It's good that we don't have an answer to this. In conjunction with the festival, it keeps our minds open, which is important, because Zhongzhong's mind is anything but. His justified hatred for the Fire Nation has developed past a hatred of their ideas, who they are made to be at the moment. It's developed into a hatred of anything they could be, a lack of hope for any change. A hatred not just of the nation, but of fire itself, and therefore, of himself. I want to be clear here that I don't mean the Fire Nation or any other violent empire, i.e. any empire, can be reformed or reasoned with. You shouldn't waste your time on that, but its people can. If you lose hope in them, you can start going down a very dark path. You should always be ruthless to systems and nations and kind to people. That's a rule I try to live by. Zhongzhong has become a doomer, basically. We see this most clearly when he sees Katara use her waterbending for healing.
You have healing abilities. I've always wished I were blessed like you, free from this burning curse. Water brings healing and life, but fire brings only destruction and pain. It forces those of us burdened with its care to walk a razor's edge between humanity and savagery. Eventually, we're torn apart.
And he passes on this trauma and unbalanced view of fire to Aang, who ends the episode by saying he will never firebend again.
I'm never gonna firebend again.
You'll have to eventually.
No, never again.
The thing is, Zhongzhong is wrong. Fire doesn't just destroy and kill. Fire isn't inherently more dangerous than the other elements. Look at his dichotomy of fire kills, water heals. It's so easy to flip it around. Water is one of the most dangerous things out there. It's basically the only environment on Earth humans can survive in for more than a few minutes. Fire is warmth. It's cooked food, it's tea, it's friends sharing stories around the campfire. All things we see this season, even before we get to season 3's The Old Masters and are shown more explicitly how wrong Zhongzhong really is. And at the same time, water does have the capacity to nourish and heal, and fire does have the capacity to kill and destroy. It's both, at once. Zhongzhong has in a way internalized one of the most corrosive parts of Fire Nation ideology, that of a cultural, biological determinism, of a lack of fluidity, of a black and white view of humans. It's hard not to see ourselves in that, I think. How much of what we think and feel about families, love, learning, living is invisibly tinted by what is, by our capitalist, patriarchal and white supremacist structures. How much work does it take to be able to imagine what could be? What would a family look like not living under patriarchy? What would schools look like if their intention wasn't to make you into a productive worker? What would being queer look like in a non-queer-phobic world? I think that's the job of leftism, trying to imagine that and working our way there. But I need to be honest. Because when I watched this episode, I didn't immediately think of all these important facets of my life. I immediately thought of one facet, being Jewish. Being Jewish when there is an apartheid state committing genocide and claiming it's in your name. I relate to Zhongzhong because I too find it hard to connect to the culture I come from, Judaism, because of the evil people and ideology that hijacked it. I know that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, and that there are plenty of fellow Jews who are true allies to the Palestinian liberation struggle, but when my best friend was kicked out of a Jewish community he cared about for saying that genocide is bad, it's hard to not just say, fuck it. To not just not bother trying to detangle Jewish community from Zionism and trying to imagine what it could be. I know logically that Judaism has existed long before the State of Israel was founded and will continue to exist long after the State of Israel is finally abolished, but I don't know if I could feel proud of my Judaism, as irrational as that is. I know this tangent is getting long. We will go back to explicitly talking about Avatar in a second. I just want to end this little personal tangent in the video with a quote that really moved me by Aaron Bushnell, the martyr who self-ignited to protest the genocide in Gaza. Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery, or the Jim Crow South, or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is, you're doing it. Right now. If this quote makes you feel bad, good. Change your life until it doesn't. You'll probably never get there fully. I sure haven't, and I'm very ashamed of that. But we all have to try. This one episode of Avatar has more depth and provokes more thought than the entire first season of Korra. And I think that kinda says it all. And I'm sure a lot of these meanings and real life applications that connected to me were not intended. Rather just came naturally from people with interesting perspectives writing a living and layered world, and letting these connections arise by themselves, be read into by the audience. That's the first pillar, the one most obvious in these two seasons, of why Korra failed where Avatar succeeded. Korra seeks to be allegorical, while Avatar seeks to be applicable. I'll let Tolkien explain the difference. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purpose domination of the author. I think this dichotomy is visible even from the way this essay is structured. The first season of Korra is about one thing, an anti-revolution and pro-status quo cautionary tale. So I was able to talk about why it's stupid in a pretty linear and simple way. The first season of Avatar is a rich tapestry of overarching and interpretable themes. At whatever age you watch it, whoever you are, you'll find something new and thought-provoking in it. Something that will mean something to you. And if that's the case for what is uncontroversially Avatar's weakest season, we are in for one hell of a ride. So the keen-eyed amongst you might have realized at this point that this video is about to be over, and I've only talked about 2 out of the 7 seasons that these 2 shows have. The reason is, this video took so long to make, and I didn't want to just not release a video for a year. So I'm splitting the series into 3 parts. Next I'm going to talk about Season 2 of Korra and Season 3 of Korra and Season 2 of Avatar, and then I'll talk about the finale seasons of both shows. If you want to get those next videos early and also access 2 videos of me talking about all my notes for Season 1 of Korra and Avatar that did not make it into this video, and there's a lot of these notes, I now have a Patreon where you can get new videos early, extra monthly videos that are Patreon exclusive, and also vote on video topics for the future. I really appreciate everyone that goes and supports me on Patreon. It really helps motivate me to make more videos. Until then, like, subscribe, comment, all that fun stuff, and of course, take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one. There's one confession I must make. I didn't fucking watch The Great Divide for this video.